Good morning, everybody, or afternoon or evening, whenever you are joining us today. Today, we are going to be talking about America turning outward. We'll be looking at American imperialism and global influence at the turn of the 20th century until the end of World War I. So about 1880s to 1920. Today's lecture, here are a few things that we'll be discussing. I will be using the term turning outward throughout this module. And I'm going to ask you, what do you think I mean? You can't really do a Google search or a keyword search in your text to find turning outward. This is a term I use just to help myself understand what was going on during this time in American history. It's something I apply to our lecture, but it's not necessarily a, widely used term in American history. I just think it's a nice way to demonstrate seemingly two different aspects of American history at this time and bringing them together. So that's one question I'll be asking you, and I'll be asking you to consider. The second is, what is your definition of imperialism? It's really easy to just do a keyword search in the textbook, or it's super easy to just type into Google, what is imperialism, right? You can do all of those things easily, but that doesn't necessarily help you understand this definition. All that is keyword finding. So I'm going to ask you today to write your own definition of imperialism. You can do a Google search to help get your juices flowing, but I want you to try to write it in your own words. And then finally, at the end of the lesson today, I'm going to be asking you to select one of the topics that I cover to focus on. And I want to know which you picked and why it interested you. Here are some of the topics that you can choose to study. I'll go into depth on all of these topics, so you don't have to choose now, but by the end of the lecture, by the end of your reading, you should have an idea of which thing interests you the most. So we'll talk about isolationism and neutrality before the 20th century. We'll look at patterns of American intervention prior to the 20th century. We'll cover the Spanish-American War, Theodore Roosevelt and American imperialism, Roosevelt's connection to imperialism in particular, women and imperialism, World War I, the war and the influenza pandemic. This might be kind of popular right now because of our connection to COVID-19, and 14 points and the League of Nations. You'll get to pick whichever one of these things interests you, and you'll get to choose based on your own curiosity. So let's start with a 1-minute write. I'm going to read a question to you and encourage you to pause the recording and reflect on the question and write on your own. So if you don't already have one, go get a piece of paper and a pen or a pencil, or you can open up a Word document on your device and you can answer this question. There will be a couple 1-minute writes throughout the lecture. Here's the first question. I will use the term turning outward throughout this module. What do you think I mean? You may have no idea what I mean, and that is okay. Just brainstorm. What do you think I mean when I say turning outward? Go ahead and pause the recording, write for about a minute, and come back when you're ready. All right, welcome back. I'm really curious to know what you thought I meant by turning outward. So let's go back to the very beginning, right? Let's go back to the very beginning of the American country as we know it, the United States of America. The very first president of America, as you all know, was George Washington. And when he retired in 1796, he gave a farewell address. This address was possibly one of the most remarkable pieces of American oration, in history. Washington did some really great things in this farewell address, but he covered two topics in particular. The first was beware of partisanship. What he meant by is beware of American institutions becoming fully divided by partisan affiliation. Today we have Republicans and Democrats. Back in the 1790s, they had Democrats and Whigs, right? They didn't have the same structures that we have. So he said, beware of political partisanship, the pulling apart of American politics based on party affiliation. He said, focus on issues, focus on the needs of the country. Don't focus on your identification with one party or another. And if you imagine today in the 21st century, we're really seeing that pulling apart. It sounds like we didn't really take his advice into consideration when we look at our own partisanship now today in a modern American lens. But that's not what we're going to talk about today. The second issue that he discussed is really our focus today. He said, avoid any and all global conflicts. Maintain a policy of neutrality. Let me give you a teeny tiny bit of perspective here. America was this baby country, right? It was this brand new infant country. All those countries across the Atlantic, Great Britain, France, Denmark, Germany, Italy, Russia, right? China, Japan, all of those countries had a much longer history at this point than America. And for centuries, mostly with regard to Europe, those countries had been at constant war with each other. But they'd also been constantly trading alliances based on royal marriages or royal family relationships. You would have like people who were living in Spain that were at war with France, who were also the king and queen were married to each other, and one was from France and one was from Spain. It was this really ongoing, like ancient rivalry, ancient warfare system. And Washington said, we're free from this. We are a brand new country. We have no conflicts and no history other than the colonial history with European countries. So he said, avoid it, stay out of it, do not get involved. Well, about 120 years later, by the end of this lecture, you'll see America had dramatically shifted from Washington's farewell address into a completely new world. So how did it work? Did it work? 1796, Washington gives this address, and what happens over the course of the next almost 100 years or so? From 1796 to 1898, for the most part, this is what America's focusing on. They're really concerned about the issue of slavery. And if you took History 103 with me or History 101 with me, you know that, right? That this was a focus of American attention until about 1865. They were worried about sectionalism, or we know it as regionalism, the role of the South, the role of the North, the role of the West, right? That was really what they were focused on. They were very concerned about the American West. We had an arrival of all sorts of revolutions, including the market revolution, the reform revolution, and industrial revolution. And then, of course, by about the 1850s, American attention is 100% on the Civil War. Okay, so it sounds like America did pretty well, according to George Washington's advice, right? They started really looking in on themselves, and they had a lot to deal with, as you know, if you've taken American history to the Civil War. So here's what I want you to do. You don't have to write. I just want you to listen to the quote and think about it. American Yop says the word empire might conjure up images of ancient Rome, the Persian Empire, or the British Empire, powers that depended variously on military conquest, colonization, occupation, or direct resource exploitation. But empires can take many forms, and imperial processes can occur in many contexts. 100 years after the United States had won its independence from the British Empire, had it become an empire of its own? So what do you think? Do you think by the late 1800s, after the Civil War is won, after America has really started to figure out the role of the South now that the Civil War is over, after slavery has been abolished and America begins claiming more territories in the West, do you think America was an empire itself? So these three topics we're going to discuss today are going to be our focus. All the while, the thread that we're going to weave is what is an empire and how is America an empire? Is it an empire? And at what point do you believe that it becomes an empire? Okay, another 1 minute right. When I say empire, I tend to be talking from like a I'm talking about a noun, right? A country or a kingdom that has an empire or a claim. When I talk about imperialism, that's sort of the action of empire, right? The creation of empire through different approaches. So I'm going to ask you to write your own answer to this question. What is your definition of imperialism? Remember, empire is a noun, imperialism is more of a verb or an active term. So pause the recording, take a minute. You can do a little bit of light research, but I really want you to come up with your own definition based on your own words. This is not because I'm trying to get you to not use Wikipedia. It's because I want you to make the connections on your own, and it will help down the road based on what you decide to research. Okay? 1 minute, right? What is your definition of imperialism? And when you're done, come on back. All right, I'm so curious to know what you thought. I'll be interested to see what your definitions of imperialism are. So here's where we're getting into those topics. And as we go slide through slide, just kind of jot down in your notes the things that jump out to you that seem interesting. All right, so here's what's happening prior to 1900. So from about 1865 until about 1900, America, though they had claimed that they were following Washington's advice and maintaining a sort of an action of neutrality, they still had lots of interventions across the globe. And they still were very economically tied to Europe. And they, you could really consider that they've focused on intervention/imperialism in the American West. Remember, the West and really all of America had been owned by Native people, right? Or at least occupied by Native people. And America was really extending its imperial holdings, empire, right, into the West from as early as the, 1600s. So let's look at imperialism or intervention up until 1900. So America had been trading with China since 1784. And they had really been sending ships into China to really claim American dominance over the Chinese market from 1784. That's all the way back to when George Washington was in charge. And then we see at the turn of the 20th century that in 1899, America established the open door policy, which called for all Western powers to have equal access to Chinese markets. And then in 1900, America intervened in the Boxer Rebellion in China. This was a movement that opposed foreign businesses and missionaries operating in China. And America intervened because they didn't want the Boxer Rebellion. They also established a few new territories, and they did this over time. So in 1856, America established the Guano Islands Act. So guano was a popular fertilizer for American plantations and farmers. And guano, as you might know, is bat excrement. And they found a way to claim territories in the Pacific that had special access to or special production of guano. And that was in 1856. And then early into the 1890s, America begins to claim Hawaii. And we won't talk too much about Hawaii today, but America ultimately claims it in 1898, but it took a lot of business efforts prior to that to establish dominance over the series of Hawaiian islands. America was also very involved in Mexico's affairs, as well as I mentioned, Native territories in the American West. 1898. This is a turning point in American history. American Yop says, although the United States had a long history of international economic, military, and cultural engagement that stretched back into the 18th century, the Spanish-American and Philippine-American Wars, 1898 and 1902, marked a crucial turning point in American interventions abroad. A crucial turning point. 1898 is a crucial turning point. 102 years after George Washington's farewell address, something happens. What is it? What changes things? Well, we're going to find out. So what happened in 1898, Dr. C? I'm on the edge of my seat. There's a couple things. The first is the Spanish-American War. Now, in other high school or college classes, you may have learned a lot about like World War II, the Vietnam War, the Civil War, but the Spanish-American War may not have been covered quite extensively in your classes. And that's because it was a short war. But really, it is a crucial moment in American history for us to understand the role of America on a global scale and the turning outward of American attention. So, the Spanish-American War, here's the backstory. In 1895, well, let's say before 1895, Spain had been claiming Cuba, right, and parts of like that area. I don't want to call it the Bahamas, but essentially those islands down by Florida. Spain and France had both had a lot of colonial dominance in that area, but Spain in particular focused quite a bit of attention on Cuba, Puerto Rico as well, right? And the people living in Cuba were not okay with this. For decades, Cubans had been resisting Spanish intervention through a series of armed revolts, violent revolts. But this one, the one in 1895, becomes decisive. And that's in part due to the fact that America is paying really close attention to what's happening in Cuba at this time. Spain, in an effort to put down, you can see from this image that I have, Spain, in an effort to put down some of these revolts, begins to relocate Cubans to internment military camps. So they begin to round up Cuban people living on the island and trying to force them into camps where essentially they'll be prisoners. Well, America responds with a relatively low stakes response. They take a battleship, the Maine, and just park it in Havana Harbor in 1898. Well, the Maine blows up. And I want you, if you're interested in this, to look into what sunk the battleship Maine. There are a couple different theories, and a lot of investigation goes into what happened. Did the Spanish bomb the Maine? Was there some sort of accident with gunpowder? What happened to sink the Maine? So even though there's investigations, formal investigations looking into what happened, yellow journalism becomes very crucial and important in this moment. When I say yellow journalism, I'm talking about sensationalized journalism. All right, a little tiny backstory for you on this. During the era of the 1880s into really present day, but we could look into like the early 20th century, the printing press had begun to print. You were able to begin printing with color ink, right? And so cheap newspapers and magazines begin using color in order to entice readers. And so you get like a little color message, right, with journalism called yellow because it's pertaining to the use of ink. But yellow journalism also refers to sensationalized journalism. That kind of journalism, like think about like TMZ or other things you might follow on your social media feed that are like not quite balanced or neutral, but like really upping the ante or upping the stakes on the information that you get. This is considered yellow journalism. Journalism that kind of overextends the excitement and the anxiety of whatever's happening. Well, yellow journalism in 1898 goes nuts over the sinking of the Maine. They begin to publish widely that the Spanish have sunk the battleship Maine. And in response, America declares war on Spain. There's another little thing that happens that causes America to declare war on Spain, but I will leave that up to you if you choose to research this particular topic to find out what else happened. What else got America into this war? Well, this is a remarkable moment because other than the Indian Wars, this is the first time America has declared war on another country, right? The Civil War, they declared war on themselves, essentially. And during the Indian Wars, they were declaring war on Native American communities already living on the continent. Well, this is the first time they declare war on another entity, a European country. Uh-oh, they're not following George Washington's advice very well, are they? Well, it lasts about 15 weeks is all, and only 400 American soldiers died in combat. And as a result of the Spanish-American War, the United States claims some major territories. John Hay, who's the Secretary of Defense, calls it a splendid little war because he says it was cheap. It was cheap in terms of finances and the cost of lives, but it was short, right? And then in the end, America got all these territories in the end. But the reason it lasted so quickly and the reason that only a few Americans died was because for decades, Cubans had been fighting this war. Cubans had been dying by the hundreds, right? And so America goes to war with Spain over the future of Cuba. And they don't necessarily give Cuba back their independence. They now claim Cuba. They now claim other territories, including Hawaii and the Philippines. So the Philippines. Some of you might be Filipino or have family members who are Filipino, so some of this is familiar to you. You may have heard this story before, you've heard about it before. But here's what happens. Why in the world are the Philippines connected to the Spanish-American War? Well, here's why. The Philippines were an afterthought of the Spanish-American War. But when the smoke cleared of this war over Cuba, part of the Treaty of Paris that was decided was that the United States is now in possession of a key foothold in the Pacific. Spain gives up all colonial rights to the Philippines. So here's the question. The Philippines, Filipinos, much like the Cubans, had been resisting Spanish control for decades. So the question becomes, will America offer its support to these Filipinos and their ongoing efforts against the Spanish? Or will Americans simply replace the Spanish as an occupying force? You can see from this picture, which is widely disseminated, if you were to Google the Philippine War, or the Philippine-American War, or Philippine insurrection, any of those things, you'll find pictures like this. There is a lot of tension in the Philippines at this time. In late January 1899, fighting begins between Americans and Filipinos. And in early April 1899, Congress then ratifies that treaty that was finalizing the Spanish-American War, which concluded that they would buy the Philippine Islands from Spain for $20 million. The Filipinos were never consulted on this. So like the Cubans, as I mentioned, Filipinos had been waging a long war against Spanish colonial efforts. And what the United States could have done by winning the Spanish-American War was giving them their independence, which they so desperately wanted. But instead, the United States occupied the islands. So from 1899 to 1902, 3 years, the US waged a bloody series of conflicts against Filipino insurrectionists that cost far more lives than any that had been lost when they were fighting against Spain. Under the leadership of Emilio Aguinaldo, Filipinos had fought for freedom against the Spanish, and now they were fighting against the United States. I'm sorry, I tripped up there a little bit on my names. So if you're interested in the Philippines, you could focus on that as well. Let's talk about Teddy Roosevelt and American imperialism. Now, Theodore Roosevelt is a really interesting character, and we are going to see a lot of him when we cover a couple things down the road in this class. But Theodore Roosevelt is a war hero of the Spanish-American War, and he was a lot of things prior to becoming president. Under his leadership, though, as president, the United States emerges from the 19th century with ambition, right? Ambition designed on global power through military might, territorial expansion, and economic influence. Here's who Roosevelt is before he becomes president. He's called the hero of San Juan Hill. He's like one of the leading military agents during the Spanish-American War. He was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Vice President, becomes president, but he becomes the most visible and influential proponent of American imperialism at the turn of the century. He's the exact opposite when it comes to the role of neutrality. He's the exact opposite from George Washington. So here's what he does as president. Roosevelt develops the American Navy. We didn't have a Navy before this. He focuses on Latin America as a key strategic place in US foreign policy. He declares big stick policy. Big stick, he used to say, speak softly and carry a big stick. Roosevelt didn't speak softly, he spoke all the time, but he used to say, show your might, show your strength as much as possible. And America is strong and we should show our big stick, right? He really believed in the pervasive and persuasive power of US military and US hegemony over important regions of the Western Hemisphere. So where George Washington said focus in, Roosevelt said focus out. He employed what was called informal methods of empire, such as economic empire building, in order to create dominance. He actively intervened again and again in Latin America, constantly sending troops, sending legislators and other sorts of diplomats to try and claim power, American power, over Latin American countries. He exerted US control over Cuba, even after Cuba gained its formal independence in 1902, as well as Puerto Rico. And he deployed naval forces to ensure Panama's independence from Colombia in 1901 because he wanted to build the Panama Canal. And then he instates the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine in 1904, which essentially gave America oversight of the Caribbean islands. That's Roosevelt for you, and he comes back big. What about women? We've talked about military, we've talked about some politicians, we've talked about colonialism, but what was going on with women in America? Well, there were two approaches to, or two visions of US imperialism among women. For the most part, when I say women, and I'm talking about the 19th century, and I'm discussing this particular topic, for the most part, white women who are Christian and middle class or upper class are the ones that the book and I are talking about. There's a reason for this. These were the most active women when it came to this discussion. I have a quote here from American Yop that says, US imperialism, which focused as much on economic and cultural influence as military or political power, offered a range of opportunities for white, middle class, Christian women. In addition to working as representatives of American business, women could serve as missionaries, teachers, and medical professionals, and as artists and writers. They were inspired by and helped transmit ideas about imperialism. So these are women who are for American imperialism. They are on the side of American dominance. Maybe they bought into this big stick concept. Maybe they bought into Roosevelt's desire to establish American might over the Western Hemisphere. Maybe they really believed in serving others like Filipinos and Hawaiians and bringing others into the American fold. But this is where white women, middle class, typically Christian or Protestant, really saw an opportunity to serve. They become teachers. They show up as nurses in some of these acquired territories. And they begin to really try to train other people how to be American, right? It's very colonialist, it's very imperialist, but there's also a lot of moral authority lended to that. But there were just as many women who were against US imperialism. Most of those women were also white, Christian, and middle class, but as you'll see, some of them were women of color. Not all women were active supporters of US imperialism. In fact, many actively opposed it. Although the most prominent public voices against imperialism were male, a lot of women made up organizations that were against American oversight or reach into other countries. For white women like Jane Addams, some of you might be interested in her, and Josephine Shaw Lowell, anti-imperialist activism was an outgrowth of their work in opposition to violence and in support of democracy. Black women like Ida B. Wells, the woman who's featured here, also became activists, right? They generally viewed imperialism as another form of racial antagonism, another form of enslavement, and drew parallels between the treatment of African Americans at home and Filipinos abroad. You saw that picture of the Filipinos in the ditch, right? That was a good example of violence against people of color that African American women who were against imperialism really demonstrated that American oversight of communities of color was often violent, was often bad, not a moral authority, the exact opposite of what some women were promoting on the other side of the debate. So here's a different moment. So that's all 1898, right? But what happens between 1898 and 1914 that brings America into a new world, right? Remember, 1796, America's like, we are neutral, we are isolationist. And then creeping into global affairs by way of the Spanish-American War, they go to war with Spain over territories, right? Because they're building their empire, even though they're not saying they are. And then from 1898 to 1914, more happens that draws America in to the global conflict that becomes World War I. You can go back to this slide throughout the discussion. I'll go ahead and I'll go ahead and link to the Google Slides in the video. So you can look back on this map. But essentially, World War I, if you look at this map, you don't see America anywhere, right? America's not a part of it. World War I is one of those long-standing tensions that occurs as a result of European alliances that get real messy and real problematic. But you can see in that kind of olive green color, you've got the Triple Alliance. That's a relationship between three countries: Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. Then in that more like Kelly green, the more kind of shamrock green, those are the Triple Entente, right? That's Russia, France, and the United Kingdom. I'm showing you this so that you kind of get a sense that like in the middle is sort of Germany and Austria-Hungary, and then on their boundaries or on their borders are the Entente, the France, United Kingdom, and Russia alliance. And then you'll see kind of in that pale green, it says Slavic allies of Russia. That comes up in a moment. So look down at Serbia, see where Serbia is. It's kind of a light green. They're aligned with Russia, and Russia is aligned with France and the United Kingdom, and they are all opposed to the Triple Alliance. What's that? Where's America? Not in here, right? Well, what happens? What brings the United States into World War I? World War I is a very complicated war to understand. It often gets overshadowed by World War II. So maybe you're really interested in military history, or you're really interested in sort of global affairs. If you are, I say go for it. Look really deeply into World War I. It's a fascinating moment in American and global history. So as I mentioned, there's a triple alliance up to about 1914 of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. Germans begin to see a threat, right? They start to see that Russia and France, as well as the Ottoman Empire in Turkey, are going to be threatening their dominance. I'm going to toggle back to the map so you can see what I'm talking about. Let's use annotate. So here's Germany, right? And they begin to feel threatened by Russia, France, and all the way down here, the Ottoman Empire and parts of this, Romania and Bulgaria. Germany is feeling worried that they will lose their dominance of this area if the Ottoman Empire becomes more powerful and aligned with Russia and France. Meanwhile, the Austrian-Hungarian Empire expands into Serbia. Remember, Serbia, this light green space. Austria-Hungary begins to expand its control into this territory, but Serbia is aligned with Russia. That's a problem, isn't it? So in response, the Serbian Principe assassinates the Austrian-Hungarian heirs to the throne. And you've heard this name before, I'm sure, Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife, the Grand Duchess Sophie. So when the Austria-Hungary Empire expands into Serbia, the response is that a Serbian national kills their leader or their future leader. Well, the Triple Alliance is together on this. So if you attack Austria-Hungary, you also attack the German Empire, you also attack Italy. Germany's already poised to go to war over the Ottoman Empire. So it's like the perfect powder keg, right? And so that's how World War I begins. Well, the US stays out of it until a couple things happen. The US is meanwhile focused on their border issue with Mexico. And that could have very well turned into a war at that moment. It becomes a conflict in the future. But right now it's, what is it like? 1914, 1912, all these things are connected. And they're having a border dispute maybe not a dispute, they're having issues with Mexico maintaining the borders that had been previously decided. They also begin to focus on Mexico's political experience right now, and Germany exploits that. So the US could have easily gone to war with Mexico again at this time, but Germany gets involved and it causes tensions with America and Germany, not just America and Mexico. Meanwhile, Wilson is providing financial support to France, the United Kingdom, and in some cases, Russia. He's sending them arms and he's sending them money. So once you begin to send money to one country, you're kind of already on their side, wouldn't you say? Meanwhile, in 1915, Germany sinks the Lusitania, which is a cruise liner, and over 100 Americans die. Of course, this becomes a huge issue. This is in the Atlantic Ocean, and there is this discussion of like, well, wait, like, why would Germany attack an American ship in international waters? That's like a full-on declaration of war, wouldn't you say? At the same time, remember, it's the turn of the century, it's the Industrial Revolution. You have millions, or at least hundreds of thousands of immigrants from different places throughout the globe who are flooding into America in order to have this, get access to this cheap labor, cheap work in American factories. Well, guess where all those folks are coming from? They're coming from places like Germany. They're coming from places like Italy. They're coming from places like Austria-Hungary, Romania, Serbia, Bulgaria, right? Greece, France, Russia. They are so many of the people who are coming to America as immigrants to work in these factories, to have a chance for home ownership or land ownership or religious freedom, whatever. They are all identified on this map because they're coming from these places. So they're like, well, we have to get involved. That's our home country. And so they begin pressuring American politicians to declare war on Germany, or at least somehow get involved in this war. Meanwhile, so America declares war, and it becomes the first time America declares war on a European country in Europe. Of course, you can't count really the Spanish-American War because that war was declared over Cuba. So the first draft in United States history occurs, and that's a selective service, which essentially calls up men of a certain age to fight in the military, because the United States didn't have a very big functioning military at the time. They really capitalized on patriotism, serve your country kind of thing, and volunteerism. And because of this, they attract a lot of people of color. They attract African Americans who are looking to claim more freedoms and rights as a response to or a result of military service. And the same is true of Mexican and Mexican Americans who are recent citizens to America because of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. So America begins calling up, drafting, and recruiting soldiers to fight in World War I on behalf of their country. This is a new slide to this lecture because in the modern situation we're in, it makes so much more sense to talk about than it used to. During World War I, another threat is discovered. And all of these things so far I've talked about are like military turning outward operations, but this is a global operation on a completely different scale. During World War I, you have the outbreak of the influenza. It is mistakenly called the Spanish flu. It wasn't actually discovered in Spain. It was discovered in Kansas, America. It's a new deadly threat. It's a strain of the flu that is just a deadly virus, and it has a global impact because the virus itself, this will sound familiar, spreads as a respiratory disease between people who are in close quarters and usually speaking to each other without masks because it's droplets in your spit that helps transmit this virus. So it spreads rapidly throughout all of the military training camps in America and in parts of Europe. And then the virus begins to mutate, similar to something that you might recognize in our recent world right now. So here's an interesting figure. Over 220,000 soldiers were hospitalized during World War I as a result of battle wounds, but almost 500,000 were hospitalized. Many of them died as a result of the virus, and no cure was ever found. So how does World War I end, and what role does America play? The new president, well, he's not new, but he's newer than Teddy Roosevelt, right? So like President Wilson is president at the time. And at the end of 1918, he becomes the first American president to travel overseas during his term. George Washington said, stay out of European affairs, stay out of global affairs, focus on your own country. And look at that, 100 and some years later, Wilson is traveling to Europe to broker the end of World War I. He intended to shape the outcome of this conflict, and he called it peace without victory. He said, let's establish an agreement of peace, kind of an alliance, right, among European countries and America, but we'll do it without finalizing warfare. We'll do it without America becoming this dominant imperialist force. He proposed a series of agreements or conditions, kind of a contract that a bunch of different countries could sign, and he just called it the 14 points. There were 14 agreements. It was an agreement that would ally European countries and America in a guarantee of peace. I mean, I think his intentions were really great, right? He was like, let's all agree and we're not going to go to war with each other. Let's be very diplomatic here. One of the points that he established was called the League of Nations. You might think or might recognize this League of Nations concept because today we have the United Nations. This was the origins of the United Nations, was Wilson's League of Nations. What it was an agreement of all countries that signed the 14 points, essentially that they wouldn't go to war with each other. They would respect each other's political and military borders, and they would negotiate conflicts among countries through diplomacy instead of war. Well, a lot of European countries went for it, but you know who didn't? The United States. So Wilson, this has got to be a huge embarrassment for him. He's overseas brokering this peace, making an agreement with all these different European countries. And meanwhile, Congress back home is like, we don't want to enter into these kind of agreements with other countries. We think this is terrible. We don't want to do that, right? We don't want to support any of this. So Wilson comes back to the United States, feeling very victorious over how well it was received in Europe. And he comes back to a hostile Congress that says, we will not ratify this treaty. We will not agree to what America has just brokered in Europe. Okay, so Wilson is like, oh my gosh, what do I do? This is a political embarrassment, and this is like his dream. So he begins traveling the country, trying to get Americans all across the United States on board with this idea so that they will pressure their congressmen at the time, to ratify the League of Nations and the 14 points. Wilson all but gives himself a stroke doing this. I mean, it is an exhausting, tiring, and very upsetting journey that he's on. Essentially, in the end, America does not ever join the League of Nations, and European countries do, but it doesn't go so well. As we'll see later, eventually it becomes the United Nations, or it sort of morphs, and then we have the United Nations. So we're coming to the end of today's lesson, but I mentioned something really briefly when I talked to you about women during this moment of imperialism. I read to you a quote from the American Yop that distinguished between a couple different approaches to colonialism, a couple different approaches to imperialism. And so I want you to compare these two. These are not my comparisons. I'm not saying Europe did it this way, America did it this way. What I'm saying is this is what Americans told each other at this time and before. Americans used to say this or distinguish this. So this is a historical argument. What I want you to think about today as a historian is, do you buy it? Do you buy this? Americans believed that European models of imperialism were antiquated. They were old, they were bad, they were misguided. They said the European model of imperialism is military or political conquest over foreign territories, the claiming of territories and resources through an army. It was the extraction of resources. Think Spain back with Mexico, or France with America, claiming furs, right, beaver pelts, or Spain trying to claim gold from the Aztec Empire or the Incan Empire, or British or Dutch, right? Efforts to go elsewhere, claim materials, bring it home for wealth. This is the old antiquated model, the way Americans saw it. Or colonialism, the establishment of little colonies in places that would essentially live and create a dominant future for that mother country. And they said this was old, this was antiquated, this was ancient. The American new model of colonialism and imperialism had to do with economic coercion, the influence of the mighty dollar, right? The claiming of alliances or territories through trade. Think about China during the Boxer Rebellion, or Hawaii, right? The claiming of territory by United States financial coercion. They also saw the opportunity for imperialism to kind of perpetuate through cultural influence. Think about like the influence America and think about those women who were like, I'll be teachers, I'll be nurses, right? The influence of other people into the American fold. This is a new model of imperialism. Or perhaps cultural influence has to do with the 14 points, American claiming of territories through diplomacy. And this is also true with moral authority. American styles of imperialism really emphasized that America was right and other countries were wrong. Cuba, for example, Spain was wrong in putting all of the Cuban insurrectionists into military camps. So America had the moral authority and had to intervene on behalf of these Cuban people. This was their claim. This isn't my claim. This was the claim at the time. So I ask you, are they really all that different? Because in the case of the Philippines, you had a bloody war between Americans and the people they were trying to help, save, liberate. It's confusing, right? So to end today's lesson, I'm going to ask you to do your 1 minute write. Scroll back through these PowerPoints, scroll back through these slides, and select the topic you want to focus on the most. Which topic did you select and why? Go ahead and write that down, and then you will see more instructions for what to do next in your assignment today. Good luck.